You are a disgusting whore who sells her body for drug money, and as of this exact second, we only have one daughter. You are completely dead to us." Those were the last words my father ever said to me. He screamed them through the phone before the line went dead. No chance to explain. No chance to defend myself. Just a cold dial tone. 7 years ago, my parents erased me from their lives. They burned my photos in the backyard fireplace. They legally struck my name from the family tree. They told all our relatives that I was a lost cause, a junkie, a disgrace. They threw me away like garbage because of a lie. Now I am 35 years old. My name is Dr. Elara Voss. I am the chief of trauma surgery at Blackridge Trauma Center in Chicago. It is a title I earned through blood, sweat, and a level of exhaustion most people cannot even begin to comprehend. I built a brand new life from the absolute ashes of my old one. I have a wonderful husband named Julian who fights for human rights. I had a mentor, Dr. Evelyn Hart, who taught me how to put broken people back together when I was broken myself. I am respected. I am needed. I am whole. But tonight, the past kicked my front door down. It was a brutal Tuesday night. The rain was slamming against the hospital windows in heavy, violent sheets. The emergency room was a madhouse, just a chaotic blur of shouting nurses, ringing monitors, and the metallic smell of blood. The double doors to the ambulance bay crashed open. The paramedics rushed a gurney through the hallway, shouting out the patient's vitals over the noise. 38-year-old female. Massive blunt force trauma from a head-on collision. She's hypotensive, tachycardic. Suspected ruptured spleen, massive internal bleeding, and a crushed pelvis. She is crashing hard, doctor. I snapped my surgical gloves on, my mind automatically shifting into the cold, clinical space it always goes to when a life is slipping away. I jogged alongside the gurney, shining a penlight into the patient's eyes to check her pupil response. Her face was covered in deep lacerations and blood, her skin pale and clammy. A nurse handed me the chart they had pulled from the patient's purse. I glanced down at the name, Vanessa Voss, my older sister. My breath caught in my throat. The world around me seemed to stop spinning for just a fraction of a second. The noise of the emergency room faded into a dull buzz. I stared at the woman on the gurney. Under the blood and the dark bruising, it was really her. The same sister who orchestrated my absolute destruction 7 years ago. The sister who lied, manipulated, and systematically tore my family away from me because she could not stand sharing the spotlight. Before I could even process the shock, a commotion broke out near the waiting room entrance. Security guards were trying to hold back 2 frantic, elderly people who were pushing their way into the trauma BAYMY parents. Richard and Helen Voss. They looked older, more fragile than I remembered. My mother was sobbing uncontrollably, her perfect hair disheveled, her expensive coat soaked from the rain. My father, Richard, a man who always prided himself on absolute control and stoicism, looked utterly terrified. I was wearing my surgical cap, a mask that covered half my face, and heavy protective eyewear. To them, I was just a nameless surgeon in blue scrubs. I was just the anonymous person standing between their daughter and a body bag. My father broke past the security guard and lunged toward me. He grabbed my arm with a desperate, crushing grip. His eyes were wide and filled with tears. "Please, doctor," he screamed, his voice cracking loudly. "You have to save her. Do whatever it takes. She is all we have left. She is our only child. Our only child." The words hit me right in the chest, sharp and familiar. Even now, even in the middle of a life-or-death crisis, the narrative held strong. I was a ghost. I didn't exist. The irony was so thick it was choking me. The daughter they threw away to protect their reputation was now the only human being on earth who had the skill to keep their only child alive. I didn't flinch. I didn't pull away in anger. I just looked directly into my father's panicked eyes, my own expression completely hidden behind the surgical mask. "We're doing everything we can, sir. You need to step back," I said. My voice was calm, disguised by the noise of the room and the mask over my mouth. I turned away from the parents who disowned me and looked down at the sister who ruined my life. Her blood pressure was plummeting fast. The monitors were screaming an alarm. She had less than 30 minutes to live if I didn't get her into the operating room immediately. Page the anesthesiologist. I ordered the head nurse, my voice steady. We are moving 2 or 3 right now. Prep for a massive transfusion protocol. As I rushed to the scrub sinks outside the operating room, I turned on the hot water and dug the rough sponge into my skin. The physical pain grounded me. I stared at my own reflection in the mirror above the sink. I had a choice to make. I could step back. I could easily hand this complicated case over to an attending surgeon. I could walk away and let someone else deal with Elara Voss. Absolutely no one would blame me if they knew the twisted history between us. But I am not them. I am a doctor. And more importantly, I am better than the people who broke me. I was going to save her life. I scrubbed the soap up my forearms. My mind aggressively pulled me back to the beginning. Back to Boston. Back to the root of this entire nightmare. It is impossible to understand the weight of this moment without understanding the incredibly messed up dynamic of the Voss family. Growing up, our house was completely unbalanced. There was never an even playing field. Vanessa was the beautiful, loud, charismatic golden child. She knew exactly how to charm adults, how to work a room, and how to make my parents look incredible to their wealthy friends. My mother, Helen, was deeply obsessed with the image of a perfect family. Vanessa was the ultimate accessory to that image. She did ballet, she did theater, she smiled perfectly for every holiday card. I was the exact opposite. I was the quiet genius. I was awkward, introverted, and preferred science textbooks to parties. I didn't fit into my mother's perfect picture, so I was largely ignored. I learned very early on that my role in the family was to be invisible. The favoritism wasn't even subtle. It was blatant and cruel. I remember when I was 16, I won a prestigious national science fair. I had spent 6 months building a complex robotics project. I came home carrying a massive trophy and a scholarship certificate. I walked into the living room, so proud I could barely speak. My father looked up from his newspaper, gave the trophy a brief glance, and said, "That's nice, Elara. Put it in your room before you scratch the table." That was it. No celebration. No family dinner. I was dismissed. The very next day, Vanessa had a small singing role in a local community theater production. She was on stage for maybe 10 minutes. My parents flew my grandparents in from Florida. They rented out a restaurant, hired a caterer, and threw a massive party for 50 people just to celebrate Vanessa singing 2 short songs. I sat in the corner of that restaurant, drinking a soda, watching my parents toast to Vanessa's extraordinary talent. I realized then that nothing I ever did would be enough. I could cure a disease, and they would still ask how Vanessa's hair looked. I accepted my fate. I didn't hate Vanessa for it back then. I just wanted to get out. I kept my head down and focused entirely on my studies. My plan was simply to escape. The real trouble, the absolute catastrophic shift in our family, only happened when I finally succeeded. I got accepted into the medical program at San Francisco University. It was one of the most competitive, elite medical schools in the country. Only a handful of students made the cut every year, and I was one of them. The acceptance letter arrived on a Tuesday. I opened it at the kitchen table. For the first time in my entire life, my father actually put his coffee down and looked at me with genuine, undivided attention. He read the letter twice. A slow smile spread across his face. He looked at me and said, "San Francisco University. Do you know how hard it is to get in there? I was talking to the CEO of my company, and his kid got rejected. And you got in." He patted my shoulder. It was a heavy, unfamiliar gesture. "Maybe you aren't a completely useless kid after all, Elara." It was a terrible, backhanded compliment. But to a girl who had been starved of parental affection for 20 years, it felt like winning the lottery. I smiled. I felt a warmth in my chest I had never felt before. But then I looked across the kitchen island. Vanessa was standing there. She was 23 at the time, still living at home, trying to become a lifestyle influencer while my parents paid all her bills. She was staring at me, and her face had completely hardened. Her eyes were cold, calculating, and filled with a sudden, vicious panic. She had realized something terrifying in that exact moment. She was about to lose the spotlight. The invisible, nerdy little sister had just done something so massive that it forced our parents to look away from her, and Vanessa Voss never, ever let anyone take her spotlight. That was the day she decided I had to be destroyed. The truth is, I never even wanted to compete with Vanessa. When I packed my bags for San Francisco, I thought the physical distance would finally bring peace to our family. I was naive. For the first 2 years of medical school, I was actually thriving. I was at the top of my class, exhausted but deeply happy. I had my books, my surgical rotations, and my absolute best friend in the world, Lena Reyes. Lena was my anchor. She was the only person in the world who knew exactly how toxic and broken my family dynamic was, and she loved me anyway, but life has a very cruel way of testing your breaking point when you are already stretched thin. During my 3rd year, the unthinkable happened. Lena was diagnosed with terminal cancer. It was aggressive, fast, and completely unforgiving. I watched the person who had been my absolute rock wither away in a hospital bed. I couldn't just leave her there alone. She had no one else either. So I made a choice. I filed all the proper paperwork, spoke to the dean of medicine, and took a perfectly legal, approved leave of absence from medical school to become Lena's full-time caregiver. I thought I was doing the right thing. I thought my family would at least understand basic human empathy. I didn't realize that I had just handed my sister the loaded gun she had been searching for since the day I got my acceptance letter. Vanessa didn't just tell a casual lie at the dinner table. What she did was a highly calculated, meticulously planned campaign of absolute destruction. She knew that our parents, especially our mother Helen, were pathologically obsessed with their flawless public image. Any hint of scandal was their ultimate nightmare. Vanessa weaponized that exact fear. While I was sleeping on a terrible plastic chair next to Lena's hospice bed, trying to manage her morphine drips and wipe her forehead, Vanessa was busy going to work on my reputation. She bought burner phones. She fabricated incredibly convincing text messages and drafted fake emails. She created fake social media profiles under different aliases to message my parents, planting poisonous little seeds about my behavior. She didn't stop there. The cruelty ran so deep it was almost psychopathic. Vanessa actually called the administration office at my medical school, pretending to be a concerned family member, and officially accused me of forging my medical leave documents. She actively tried to get me expelled while I was literally watching my best friend die. But the final blow, the one that severed my ties to my family forever, was a masterpiece of pure malice. Vanessa sat down in the living room of our childhood home, looked my parents dead in the eye, and delivered the killing strike. She told them that the entire story about Lena having cancer was completely fake. She told them I had dropped out of school because I was severely addicted to hard drugs and deeply involved with dangerous, violent criminals. And then, she dropped the line that she knew would permanently shatter my father's pride. She looked at them and said, "She is selling her body to pay for her drug debts." It was a lie so outrageous, so completely detached from reality, that any normal parent would immediately call their child to demand an explanation. They would ask for proof. They would get in their car and drive to San Francisco to see for themselves. But Richard and Helen Voss were not normal parents. They were cowards who protected their country club status above all else. They swallowed Vanessa's poison without asking a single question. That was when I got the phone call. The one where my father screamed that I was a disgusting whore and declared me dead to them. I stood in the hallway of the oncology ward, holding the phone, my hands shaking so violently I dropped it. I picked it up and tried to call back. Blocked. I tried my mother's number. Blocked. I spent the next week writing frantic, desperate letters, begging them to call the hospital, begging them to just come look at Lena's medical charts to see the truth with their own eyes. Every single letter came back a week later, stamped return to sender, completely unopened. They didn't just cut me off financially, they executed a total and complete erasure of my existence. My father walked into the backyard, lit a fire, and literally burned every single photograph that had my face in it. My mother, cold and methodical as always, contacted their lawyers and legally removed my name from the family tree and the estate. They called every aunt, uncle, and cousin we had, strictly forbidding anyone from speaking to me. They announced to our entire extended family, "We only have one daughter." I was completely stranded in the darkest moment of my life. I had zero financial support. My family had effectively held a funeral for me while I was still breathing, and my best friend was slipping away 2 weeks after my father's phone call. Lena's heart finally stopped beating. She died. I was 28 years old, utterly broken, and entirely alone. I had to arrange Lena's cremation by myself. I picked out a cheap urn because it was literally all I could afford. I sat in an empty room at the funeral home, staring at the wall, feeling a level of emptiness that physically hurt my chest. No parents to hold me, no sister to lean on. Just absolute, suffocating silence. I remember walking back to the tiny, miserable apartment I was renting. I was seriously considering just giving up. What was the point? My family believed I was a degenerate criminal. My best friend was ash in a box. The grief was so heavy I couldn't breathe. I started packing up Lena's few remaining belongings into cardboard boxes, tears blindly streaming down my face. As I was emptying her nightstand, a small, folded piece of yellow notebook paper slipped out from between the pages of her favorite book. I picked it up with shaking fingers and unfolded it. It was Lena's messy, looping handwriting, written near the very end when she knew she wasn't going to make IT. IT just said, "Don't let them decide who you are." I stared at those 8 words for hours. I sat on the cold hardwood floor as the sun went down and came back up again. Something shifted inside me that night. The crushing, paralyzing despair slowly started to harden into something else. It wasn't exactly anger. It was a cold, razor-sharp resolve. Vanessa wanted me destroyed. My parents wanted me erased. They wanted me to be the failure they had always treated me as. But I held Lena's note in my hand, and I made a promise to the empty room. I was going to survive this. I was going to climb out of the absolute bottom of the abyss, and I was going to build a life so incredibly untouchable that their lies would never, ever be able to reach me again. The betrayal didn't just break my heart. It fundamentally rewired my brain. When the people who are supposed to protect you are the ones who orchestrate your execution, you lose the ability to trust easily. I realized that the only person in the universe I could completely rely on was myself. Vanessa's victory felt absolute in that moment. She had successfully cleared the stage. She was back to being the only child, the flawless golden girl living in our parents' massive house, completely unchallenged. She had stolen my family, destroyed my reputation, and isolated me during a massive personal tragedy. She probably slept like a baby, completely convinced that the nerdy, invisible little sister she pushed into the dirt would simply stay there and rot away, but she severely underestimated me. She forgot that while she spent her entire life learning how to perform and manipulate, I had spent mine learning how to solve complex problems under immense pressure. And my new problem was sheer survival. I didn't have the luxury of depression anymore. I didn't have a safety net. If I fell, I would hit the concrete. So I decided I simply wasn't going to fall. The girl who desperately wanted her parents' approval died the same week Lena did. The woman who took her place was focused, ruthless, and entirely bulletproof. Going back to San Francisco University was not some cinematic, triumphant return where everyone clapped for me. It was a brutal, ugly, and exhausting crawl through broken glass. After Lena died, and my family officially erased me from their lives, I had absolutely zero financial safety net. My parents had completely cut off my tuition payments, my rent allowance, and even my health insurance. I was completely on my own. But I held on to the note Lena left me, the one telling me not to let them decide who I was, and I used it as pure fuel. I marched into the dean's office, explained that my financial situation had catastrophically changed, and begged for any available scholarships or grants. I took out massive student loans that would take me decades to pay off, just to cover the bare minimum of my tuition, but tuition was only half the problem. I still had to eat, pay rent, and buy medical textbooks that cost hundreds of dollars each. So, I completely stopped sleeping and worked 3 jobs at the exact same time. My routine was punishing. I would wake up at 4 in the morning to study before classes. During the day, I attended my grueling medical lectures and clinical rotations. In the late afternoons, I worked as a research assistant in a university biology lab, cleaning test tubes and logging data for minimum wage. Then, instead of going home to rest, I would take a bus across the city to work night shifts at a local hospital. I wasn't doing glamorous work. I was drawing blood, changing bedpans, transporting patients, and doing whatever grunt work the nursing staff needed me to do. I lived off cheap instant noodles, stale coffee, and the sheer, stubborn refusal to let my sister win. I studied frantically in the hospital break room during my 15-minute shifts, fighting off exhaustion that made my bones physically ache. The isolation would have completely broken me if it wasn't for one person. My Aunt Margot. She was my father's younger sister, and she was the only person in my entire extended family who flat out refused to believe Vanessa's lies. When my parents called their family meeting to declare me dead to them, Margot told my father he was being a gullible fool and walked right out of his house. Because of that, my parents cut her off too. Margot didn't have much money to give me, but she called me every single Sunday. She listened to me cry when the stress of medical school and my 3 jobs became too heavy. She was the only tether I had to my past, the only reminder that I wasn't actually crazy and that I had been severely wronged. Having just one person believe in my innocence gave me the strength to keep pushing forward. That relentless drive eventually caught the attention of Dr. Evelyn Hart. Dr. Hart was a legendary trauma surgeon at the university hospital and an absolute terror to the residents. She was brilliant, demanding, and famous for kicking students out of her operating room if they hesitated for even a second. One night, during a particularly chaotic shift in the emergency room, she caught me accurately diagnosing a complex internal bleed on a patient before the resident on duty even looked at the chart. She didn't praise me. She just stared at me with sharp, calculating eyes and asked why I looked like I hadn't slept in a year. I told her the short version of my situation. From that day on, Dr. Hart became my mentor. She didn't offer me sympathy. She offered me an incredibly harsh, demanding education. She pushed me harder than anyone else, teaching me how to stay perfectly calm when a patient was bleeding out, how to shut off my personal emotions, and how to command a trauma bay. She molded me into a machine. Thanks to my insane schedule and Dr. Hart's guidance, I didn't just survive medical school, I graduated with absolute top honors. I scored in the highest percentile on my medical board exams and matched into one of the most brutally difficult and competitive surgical residency programs in the country, right here in Chicago. Moving to Chicago was the fresh start I desperately needed. The residency program was a nightmare of 100-hour work weeks, but compared to what I had already survived, it felt manageable. I threw myself entirely into trauma surgery. I loved the immediate, high-stakes nature of it. You either fix the problem right then or the patient dies. There is no room for manipulation or lies in the trauma bay. It is just you, your skills, and the truth of the human body. It was during my second year of residency in Chicago that I met Julian Cross. Julian was a human rights lawyer who spent his life fighting for people who had been abused, marginalized, or completely forgotten by the system. We met in the hospital cafeteria after he came in to interview a client who had been severely assaulted. We started arguing over hospital visitation policies, and that argument turned into coffee, which turned into dinner. Julian was everything my family wasn't. He was honest, intensely loyal, and deeply committed to actual justice. When I finally told him the truth about my past, about Vanessa's lies, Lena's death, and my parents disowning me, he didn't pity me. He looked at me with immense respect. He understood exactly what it took for me to build myself back up from nothing. We got married 3 years later in a tiny, quiet ceremony at a local courthouse. There were no parents there. Just Aunt Margot, Dr. Evelyn Hart, and a few close friends. With Julian by my side grounding me, my career skyrocketed. I worked my way up the hospital hierarchy with a singular, unbreakable focus. I took the hardest cases, the longest shifts, and the most complicated surgeries. My reputation for staying ice-cold under pressure spread quickly. By the time I turned 35, I was officially appointed as the chief of trauma surgery at Blackridge Trauma Center. I was the youngest person in the entire history of the hospital to ever hold that position. I had finally done it. I had built a life so incredibly successful, so deeply respected, and so entirely secure that my toxic family could never reach me. I was completely untouchable, or so I thought. The real, horrifying truth about my sister's deep sickness only came to light a few months ago. Julian, because of his work as a lawyer, is very careful about digital security and background checks. One evening, he was reviewing our home network logs and noticed some very strange, persistent anomalies. He dug deeper and discovered that someone had been quietly, persistently tracking my digital footprint for years. Someone had been looking up my public medical license records, trying to access my hospital directory files, and reading every single article or press release that mentioned my name. Julian used his investigative contacts to trace the IP addresses and the dummy accounts, making the searches. What he found made my blood run completely cold. It was Vanessa. She wasn't just living her happy, perfect life in Boston as the golden child. She had been actively, obsessively stalking me for 7 years. But she wasn't just watching me from afar. Julian found a trail of completely unhinged, anonymous complaints filed with the state medical board against my license, trying to accuse me of malpractice. He found fake emails sent to the hospital administration, attempting to spread rumors about my past. Fortunately, because she had no real proof and hospital security filters are robust, all her attempts had been flagged as spam or dismissed as baseless internet harassment. I never even knew about them, but the terrifying realization hit me hard. Vanessa didn't just tell a lie to get me out of the house. She had a deep, pathological obsession with my destruction. Even after she completely won, even after she stole my parents and got me erased from the family, she still spent the next 7 years trying to sabotage my career from across the country. She simply could not handle the fact that I had survived. She wanted me completely ruined, forever. And now, this exact same woman, the sister who spent nearly a decade trying to destroy my entire existence, was lying on my operating table, her life completely in my hands. I pushed through the swinging doors of operating room 3 with my hands held up, dripping with iodine, ready to face the absolute chaos waiting for me inside. The environment inside the trauma was a completely different world from the loud, panic-stricken emergency department. It was freezing cold, brightly lit, and heavily saturated with a tense, hyper-focused energy. The patient was already on the surgical table, draped in sterile blue sheets, with only the massive trauma area of her abdomen exposed to the harsh overhead lights. My surgical team was standing by, instruments ready, their eyes locked on me as I walked in. They didn't know the dark history in this room. They didn't know that the woman bleeding to death on the table was Elara Voss, the sister who had orchestrated the absolute destruction of my life. To them, she was just another severe, anonymous trauma case on a miserable Tuesday night. I stepped up to the table and immediately looked up at the monitors. Her vitals were completely tanking, the numbers dropping faster than I could process them. The blunt force trauma from the head-on collision had absolutely devastated her internal organs. We were dealing with a severely ruptured liver, a shattered spleen, and massive internal bleeding that was filling her abdominal cavities so fast that her skin was actually distending. The anesthesiologist looked over the surgical drape at me, his eyes wide with urgency and fear. He didn't have to say a word, because the terrifying reality was hanging heavy in the cold air. She had less than 30 minutes to live if I didn't get this catastrophic bleeding under control immediately. This was the defining moment. The universe had literally placed the life of my worst enemy squarely in my hands. I had a clear choice right then and there. I could easily step back, cite a conflict of interest, and hand the scalpel over to the attending surgeon on call. I could just walk away and let someone else deal with the bloody mess that was my sister. If she died on their table, it wouldn't be my fault, and honestly, a dark part of my brain whispered that it would be poetic justice. But I didn't hesitate. I chose to save her, without a single second of hesitation. Not because I forgave her for what she did to me. Not because I still loved her, but because I am a doctor and I absolutely refuse to let the darkness of my past and her toxic lies compromise the integrity of who I have become. Scalpel, I said, my voice steady, deep, and completely devoid of any emotion. A scrub nurse slapped the cold metal instrument into my gloved hand. I made the first incision, a long, deep cut right down the center of her abdomen. The very second I opened the peritoneal cavity, a massive wave of dark, pooling blood spilled out onto the drapes. It was a completely catastrophic bleed. More suction, I ordered, not taking my eyes off the cavity. Get me laparotomy pads, lots of them. We need to pack the 4 quadrants immediately. Hang 2 more units of O-negative blood on the rapid infuser right now. My hands moved with a mechanical, practiced precision that bypassed the chaos entirely and went straight for the source of the trauma. The spleen was completely pulverized. It was practically shredded and totally unsalvageable. I quickly clamped the splenic artery and removed the ruined organ just to stop that specific source of hemorrhage. But the liver was the real nightmare in this situation. It was torn open in a jagged, incredibly complex laceration that was actively pumping bright red blood deep into her belly. Blood pressure is dropping fast, the anesthesiologist shouted over the noise of the machines. 60/40. She's severely tachycardic. Heart rate is spiking to 140. Keep pumping fluids, I replied, pressing down with immense physical pressure on her liver with both of my hands, desperately trying to manually staunch the bleeding, and then the horrible, high-pitched, continuous tone of the heart monitor filled the operating room. She is coding. We lost the pulse. Her heart stopped. The first time. Start chest compressions. I yelled, refusing to move my hands from her slippery, damaged liver. Push 1 milligram of epinephrine. A nurse jumped onto the step stool next to the table and started hammering on Vanessa's chest. I stood there, holding my sister's broken liver together, feeling the rhythmic, violent shaking of the CPR compressions vibrating through her body and straight into my own arms. It was an incredibly surreal, out-of-body experience. The woman who wanted me completely dead to the world was now physically relying on the strength of my 2 hands to keep her blood inside her body. Come on, I muttered under my breath, gritting my teeth. You don't get to die easily. Not today. We have a pulse, the anesthesiologist called out after 2 grueling, sweat-inducing minutes of CPR. Pressure is marginal, but she is back. All right, let's move, I commanded, shifting my focus entirely to repairing the massive liver lacerations. I started suturing the deep tears, throwing stitches faster than I ever had in my entire career. The tension in the room was incredibly thick. Nobody spoke a single word unless it was strictly medical. 30 minutes later, the alarm screamed again, piercing through the silence. V-fib. She's in ventricular fibrillation. Her heart stopped for the second time. Charge the paddles to 200 joules, I ordered, stepping back from the table and dropping my instruments. Clear. The electric shock ripped through her body, causing her chest to violently jerk upward off the metal table. I stared hard at the monitor. Flatline. Charge to 300. Clear. Another violent jolt. The monitor hesitated for a terrifying second, then slowly picked up a ragged, weak rhythm. She was back again. The sheer physical toll of the surgery was really starting to set in on me. My lower back was screaming in pain, my legs were going numb from standing in the exact same position, and sweat was pooling heavily under my surgical cap. The metallic smell of blood and cauterized flesh was overwhelming. But I absolutely refused to stop. I painstakingly repaired the liver, millimeter by millimeter. I stopped the secondary bleeding in her crushed pelvis. I meticulously ran her bowel, checking every single inch of her intestinal tract for any hidden perforations. We were now 4 hours into the procedure. It was an absolute marathon of endurance. My gloves were stained dark red, and my forearm muscles were visibly trembling from the sustained effort of operating. And then, just as I was preparing to start the final washout of her abdomen, the monitor gave a final, sad warning beep before flatlining completely. The 3rd time her heart stopped. Asystole, the anesthesiologist said, his voice dropping heavily in defeat. Elara, we've pumped her full of everything we have. Her body has just been through way too much trauma to sustain life. No, I snapped, my voice cracking like a whip across the dead silent room. We are not losing her. Push another round of AP. Resume compressions immediately. I physically pushed the nurse aside, stepped onto the stool, and started doing the chest compressions myself. I locked my elbows and drove my entire body weight down onto Vanessa's sternum, over and over again. I was panting heavily, my breath totally fogging up my clear plastic face shield. I was not going to let her slip away into the dark. She owed me a real conversation. She owed the universe the actual truth. She was going to live to face exactly what she had done to me. "Come back," I yelled, the cold professional mask finally slipping just a tiny fraction. I slammed my hands down again hard. "Damn it, Vanessa, come back." I felt a rib crack under the heel of my palms, but I didn't stop the rhythm. 3 minutes passed. 4 agonizing minutes. The surgical team was completely silent, watching me with a mixture of absolute awe and sheer terror. They were looking at me like I was some kind of living legend, a completely relentless machine that absolutely refused to accept death as an answer. And then, a single beep cut through the air. Then another. The jagged green lines spiked across the black monitor screen. "We got her," the anesthesiologist whispered, wiping his forehead with the back of his arm. "Normal sinus rhythm. Blood pressure is actually stabilizing now." I stopped the compressions and stepped back, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. The surgery had lasted 5 grueling, violent hours. We had pulled her back from the absolute brink of death 3 separate times. I looked down at the table. Her abdomen was temporarily closed, the catastrophic bleeding was finally controlled, and she was stable enough to be carefully moved to the surgical intensive care unit. I stripped off my bloody gloves and my heavily soiled surgical gown, throwing them into the red biohazard bin with a wet thud. I washed my hands at the scrub sink outside the room, staring blankly at the swirling pink water going down the drain. I had done it. I had survived the hardest surgery of my life, and I had saved her. Now, I had to walk out into that waiting room. I had to face the parents who threw me away like literal garbage. I had to face the people who completely erased my existence from their world, and I had to look them in the eye and tell them that the nameless doctor who just performed a 5-hour miracle to save their precious, perfect daughter was me. I pushed open the heavy double doors leading from the sterile surgical wing into the main family waiting area. The bright, harsh fluorescent lights of the hallway immediately hit my eyes, making me blink away the exhaustion. My body felt like it was made of solid lead. The surgery had lasted 5 grueling hours, and we had pulled Vanessa back from the absolute brink of death 3 separate times. My blue scrubs were heavily wrinkled and carried the faint, metallic scent of the operating room. I was still wearing my surgical cap, my face mostly obscured by the blue mask and the clear protective eyewear. To anyone sitting in that room, I was just a nameless, faceless surgeon coming to deliver the news. My parents, Richard and Helen Voss, were sitting on a stiff vinyl couch in the far corner of the room. They looked absolutely terrible. My mother, Helen, a woman who had spent her entire life completely obsessed with maintaining a flawless public image, looked completely undone. Her designer clothes were ruined, her makeup was smeared down her cheeks, and she was shaking uncontrollably. My father, a famously conservative and stoic businessman, looked hollowed out, staring blankly at the floor. They looked like 2 people who had just watched their entire world collapse. They saw me walking toward them and instantly jumped to their feet, their eyes wide with a desperate, terrified kind of hope. "Doctor, my daughter," my father pleaded, his voice cracking violently as he stepped toward me, his hands trembling. "Please tell me she is alive. Please." I stopped walking. I stood about 5 feet away from them, letting the space between us hang heavy in the quiet room. I didn't say anything at first. I just looked at them. I looked at the 2 people who had completely erased me from their lives, who had burned my photographs, and who had told the entire world that I was a worthless drug addict. Then, very slowly, I reached up with both hands. I pulled off my protective eyewear and let it hang around my neck. I reached behind my head, untied the strings of my surgical mask, and pulled it down, completely exposing my face. I finally pulled off my surgical cap, letting my hair fall loose around my shoulders. I looked my father dead in the eye and said, "I am her doctor. And I am also the daughter that you abandoned." An absolute, Suffocating silence dropped over the waiting room. It was the kind of silence that actually rings in your ears. My father's mouth fell open, but no sound came out. He physically stumbled backward, hitting the edge of a coffee table, his eyes darting frantically across my face, as if he was looking at a ghost. My mother just froze entirely, the breath hitching in her throat. The cognitive dissonance happening in their brains right at that moment must have been staggering. They had spent the last 7 years fully believing the lie that I was a degenerate criminal selling my body on the streets. And now, I was standing right in front of them in clean surgeon scrubs, having just spent 5 hours saving the life of their golden child. "Elara?" my mother whispered, her voice barely audible, sounding like she was choking on the name she had legally removed from our family tree. It can't be you." "It is me," I said, my tone remaining completely flat and clinical. "Your daughter, Vanessa, was brought in with a ruptured liver, a shattered spleen, and massive internal bleeding. She had less than 30 minutes to live if I hadn't operated. I am the chief of trauma surgery at this hospital. I just spent the last 5 hours keeping her heart beating. She is currently stable and being moved to the ICU. She will survive." Before they could even process the massive shock of my identity or the medical update, the waiting room doors opened again. Julian, my husband, walked in. He was wearing a dark suit, looking incredibly sharp and completely furious. And walking right beside him was someone my parents hadn't spoken to in 7 years. Aunt Margot. Margot was the only person in our entire extended family who had flat out refused to believe Vanessa's lies, the only one who had stood by me when I hit absolute rock bottom. My father looked from me to Margot, his face twisting into a mask of pure confusion. "Margot? What are you doing here? What is happening?" Margot didn't offer a polite greeting. She walked right up to my father and slammed a thick, heavy manila folder down onto the coffee table between them. She looked at her older brother with a level of disgust I had never seen before. "I came to show you exactly how much of a fool you are, Richard," Margot said, her voice sharp as glass. "I came to show you the absolute monster you raised and the brilliant daughter you threw away." Julian stepped forward and opened the folder. He is a human rights lawyer, and he knows exactly how to build an undeniable case. "Mr. and Mrs. Voss," Julian said coldly. "My name is Julian Cross. I am Elara's husband. For the past few months, we have been investigating a massive string of cyberstalking and harassment directed at my wife's medical license. I tracked the IP addresses and the dummy accounts directly back to Vanessa's home in Boston. Your daughter has spent the last 7 years obsessively trying to destroy Elara's career from the shadows." "That is a lie," my mother shrieked, suddenly finding her voice, her desperate need to protect Vanessa's image overriding her shock. "Vanessa would never do that. She is a good girl. Stop talking, Helen, and look at the damn papers," Margot snapped, pulling out a stack of printed documents from the folder. "You wanted proof 7 years ago? Here it is." Julian and a private investigator dug up everything. Margot shoved the papers into my father's shaking hands. "These are the real emails Elara sent from her university," Margot explained, pointing at the highlighted dates and addresses. "And these are the fake text messages Vanessa generated from burner phones to make you think Elara was doing drugs. Vanessa meticulously planned the entire thing. She literally fabricated a fake identity to call Elara's medical school and try to get her expelled while Elara was watching her best friend die of cancer." My father was staring at the papers, his hands shaking so violently that the pages were rattling. He was reading the IP logs, the timestamps, and the undeniable digital footprint of his oldest daughter's pure malice. Then, Julian pulled out his phone and placed it on the table. "And this," Julian said, "is an audio file we recovered from one of Vanessa's old iCloud backups. It is a voice memo she recorded herself, practicing the exact lie she was going to tell you about Elara selling her body." Julian pressed play. The waiting room was dead silent as Vanessa's voice, clear and chillingly calm, filled the air. She was literally rehearsing the fake tears and the dramatic pauses she used to ruin my life. She was laughing in the recording, complaining about how stupid our parents were and how easy it was going to be to get me kicked out of the house. The audio file ended, and the silence returned, heavier and darker than before, My mother let out a horrific, guttural sound. It was a noise of pure, agonizing realization. Her legs literally gave out underneath her. She collapsed entirely, dropping to her knees on the waiting room floor, her hands covering her face as she began to wail uncontrollably. Her entire reality, the perfect family image she worshipped, was completely shattered into pieces. I looked at my father. The stoic, powerful businessman who had ordered me to leave his house, who had burned my existence to the ground, was breaking apart right in front of me. Tears spilled over his lower eyelids and streamed down his wrinkled face. It was the very first time in my entire life I had ever seen my father cry. He looked completely destroyed. Elara. He choked out, falling to his knees right next to my mother. He looked up at me, his face twisted in absolute agony. Oh my God, what have we done? Elara, I am so sorry. What did we do to you? I stood there, looking down at the two people who were supposed to protect me. I didn't feel a sudden rush of vindication. I didn't feel the urge to scream at them or tear them down. All I felt was a cold, distant clarity. Vanessa was completely cornered now. When she finally woke up from her medically induced coma, she wouldn't be able to lie her way out of this. She was trapped in the reality of her own making. The truth had finally exploded, and there was nowhere left for her to hide. I had survived the absolute worst they could do to me, and I had come out on the other side as a completely different person. I didn't need their tears, and I didn't need their apologies. I had already won. My father was still kneeling on the cold linoleum floor of the hospital waiting room, his expensive suit wrinkling around his knees, the tears freely tracking down his aging face. My mother was completely curled in on herself on the floor beside him, her perfectly manicured hands covering her face as she let out these awful, broken sobbing noises. It was a scene of absolute, total devastation. For 28 years of my life, I had looked at these two people as the ultimate authorities of my universe. I had spent my entire childhood desperately craving just a fraction of the love and attention they so easily showered onto Vanessa. When they disowned me, when they burned my photos and erased my name, it felt like the sky was physically crushing me. I had spent countless nights in my miserable, freezing apartment in San Francisco crying until I threw up, begging the universe to tell me what I did wrong to make my own parents hate me so much. But looking at them right now, broken and sobbing at my feet, I felt absolutely nothing. There was no sudden, cinematic rush of vindication. I did not scream, and I did not seek revenge. I didn't feel the burning urge to grab them by the shoulders and demand to know how they could have been so incredibly stupid and cruel. The anger that had fueled my grueling 100-hour work weeks during my surgical residency was just gone. It had completely evaporated, leaving behind a cold, crystal-clear calm. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was entirely about power. And standing there in my blood-stained surgical scrubs, looking down at the people who had tried to legally and emotionally execute me, I realized that I held all of it. I was a highly respected trauma surgeon. I had a husband who loved me unconditionally. I had saved the life of the very person who tried to destroy mine. I was completely whole, and they were completely shattered. My father reached out a trembling hand, trying to grasp the fabric of my scrub pants. I calmly took half a step backward, moving just out of his reach. The physical rejection made him flinch, as if I had actually struck him across the face. "Elara, please," he begged, his voice a raspy, desperate whisper. We didn't know. We didn't know she was lying to us. She looked us right in the eye and told us you were dying on the streets. We were just trying to protect the family. You have to believe me, please. We can fix this. We can make it right. You are our daughter. I stared at him. The sheer audacity of his words hung in the air, heavy and ridiculous. You didn't know because you didn't want to know, I said, my voice completely steady and brutally quiet. You didn't ask for a single shred of proof. You didn't drive to my apartment. You didn't call my medical school. You just blocked my number, returned my letters unopened, and held a literal funeral for me while I was watching my best friend die in a hospice bed. You chose to believe a lie because it was easier than actually being a parent to a daughter who didn't fit into your perfect country club aesthetic. My mother let out another loud wail, rocking back and forth on her heels. "We are so sorry. Oh God, Elara, we are so sorry. We will give you anything. We will do whatever you want." I slowly shook my head. "I don't want anything from you. I built a life out of the absolute ashes you left me in. Family is not something you have the right to take away and then take back when it is convenient," I told them, my voice echoing slightly in the sterile room. "You made your choice 7 years ago. You legally struck my name from your estate. You told everyone you only had one daughter. And you were right. You only have one daughter. She is currently recovering in the intensive care unit." Julian stepped forward, placing a warm, heavy hand on my lower back. It was a silent gesture of absolute support, a physical reminder that I was not alone in this room anymore. Aunt Margot stood next to him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, glaring down at her brother with a look of pure, unfiltered disgust. "You reap exactly what you sow, Richard," Margot said sharply. "You spent your entire life cultivating a fake, superficial image, and you let a vicious liar destroy the only truly brilliant thing your family ever produced. You don't get to cry about it now." I looked past my parents, my eyes drifting toward the heavy double doors that led to the intensive care unit. The reality of the situation was rapidly settling in. Vanessa was completely cornered now. She was lying in a hospital bed, hooked up to a dozen machines, recovering from a massive physical trauma. But the physical pain was going to be nothing compared to the reality she was about to wake up to. For 7 years, she had lived a completely unchallenged, luxurious life in Boston, basking in our parents' undivided attention while secretly obsessing over my ruin. She had thought she was completely untouchable, but Julian's investigation had brought all her meticulously hidden skeletons directly into the light. When she finally opened her eyes and the anesthesia wore off, she wouldn't be able to cry, manipulate, or lie her way out of this trap. The digital footprint was undeniable. The voice recordings were undeniable. She would be shunned by the entire extended family and lose the flawless reputation she had literally destroyed my life to protect. She had finally dug a hole so deep that even our parents' money couldn't pull her out of it. "She is going to survive the surgery," I said, bringing my attention back to the 2 weeping people on the floor. "I repaired her liver. I stopped the internal bleeding. Physically, she will eventually recover. But she is going to wake up to a completely different world. And you two are going to have to look at her every single day for the rest of your lives, knowing exactly what kind of monster you raised." I didn't wait for another apology. I didn't want to hear another desperate excuse. I simply turned around and started walking toward the exit of the waiting room. "Elara, wait!" my father yelled out, scrambling to his feet, his dress shoes slipping slightly on the slick floor. "Please don't walk away. Not again." I didn't stop. I didn't even turn my head. I pushed open the heavy wooden doors and walked out into the main corridor of the hospital. Julian and Margot were right beside me, matching my pace. The air in the hallway felt incredibly light. The crushing, suffocating weight that I had carried in my chest for the last 7 years, the invisible burden of being the discarded, hated child, was completely gone. I had finally looked my demons dead in the eye, and they had crumbled into dust. We walked out through the automatic sliding doors of the hospital lobby and stepped out into the early morning air. The violent rainstorm that had been raging when Vanessa's ambulance arrived had finally broken. The sky was a soft, bruised purple, and the city of Chicago was just starting to wake up. The smell of wet asphalt and cold wind hit my face, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I took a deep, completely unburdened breath. I knew my parents would eventually have to go to psychological therapy to deal with the absolute ruin of their perfect world. I knew they would spend the next several years drowning in their own guilt, desperately trying to figure out how their flawless family had rotted so completely from the inside out. They would have to deal with the fallout of Vanessa's psychotic behavior, the sheer embarrassment of the truth spreading through their wealthy social circles, and the horrifying realization that they had thrown away their only innocent child. But none of that was my problem anymore. I had done my job. I had honored my medical oath. I had saved a life tonight, and in the process, I had finally, permanently reclaimed my own. The aftermath of that night in the hospital was a slow, brutal unraveling for the people who had once thought they were untouchable. When Vanessa finally opened her eyes in the intensive care unit a week later, the heavy haze of anesthesia slowly clearing from her brain, she did not wake up to a room full of flowers, balloons, or our doting parents rushing to her bedside. She woke up to absolute, terrifying silence. The reality of what Julian and Aunt Margot had exposed had already ripped through our entire extended family, like a violent shockwave. Margot had made absolutely sure of it. She took the manila folder filled with the undeniable proof of Vanessa's 7-year stalking campaign, the fake emails, the burner phone receipts, and the audio recordings, and she meticulously sent copies to every single aunt, uncle, and cousin we had. The flawless, golden child reputation that Vanessa had literally destroyed my life to protect evaporated overnight. She lost her reputation completely. The very people who had once praised her endless charm and perfect smile now looked at her with pure disgust. She was officially shunned by the entire family. Nobody visited her in the hospital. Nobody called her phone. She was left entirely alone in that sterile room to sit with the physical agony of her shattered body and the crushing realization that her sociopathic lies had finally caught up to her. For my parents, Richard and Helen Voss, the fallout was a completely different kind of hell. They couldn't just brush this scandal under the rug or buy their way out of it like they had done with every other minor inconvenience in their lives. The illusion of their perfect country club family was dead and buried. The sheer weight of their guilt, the horrifying knowledge that they had actively participated in the emotional execution of their only innocent child, completely broke them down. For the first time in their entire lives, they were forced to look at themselves in the mirror and acknowledge the incredibly toxic environment they had created. They actually started going to intensive psychological therapy. My Aunt Margot told me later that the therapy sessions were absolutely agonizing for them. My mother, a woman who had spent her entire existence obsessing over outward appearances, had to sit in a chair and verbally admit to a professional therapist that she had chosen a comfortable lie over her own daughter's life. My father had to confront the massive, fragile ego that had allowed him to scream those terrible words at me through the phone 7 years ago. They had to systematically dismantle decades of terrible parenting and face the monster they had enabled Vanessa to become. And as they did the grueling mental work, they began their desperate attempts to try and make amends. It started small. I began receiving letters at the hospital. Not demanding, frantic letters, but quiet, deeply remorseful apologies written in my father's precise handwriting. They didn't ask for forgiveness, because their therapist had correctly advised them that they had absolutely no right to demand anything from me ever again. They just wanted me to know that they knew the truth, and that they were carrying the full weight of their massive failure. They paid off the remaining, massive balance of my medical school student loans anonymously, though Julian easily traced the wire transfer back to my father's accounts. They even made a massive, silent donation to the hospice care center where Lena had spent her final days. They were desperately trying to put some good back into a world they had so selfishly poisoned, but I didn't engage with any of it. I didn't return the money, and I didn't write back to the letters. I simply let them sit with the consequences of their actions while I continued to move entirely forward. I was deeply focused on building my own life with my new family and reaching the absolute peak of my career. My world was completely full. I had Julian, who was my absolute rock and the love of my life. I had Aunt Margot, who came over for dinner every Sunday night and filled our house with loud, unapologetic laughter. I had Dr. Evelyn Hart, who still terrified the surgical residents but treated me as an equal and a trusted friend. I was the chief of trauma surgery, saving lives every single day, leading a massive department of brilliant doctors and doing work that genuinely mattered. I didn't have a single empty space in my life for the ghosts of my past. I was completely at peace, until a quiet, overcast Sunday morning, about 6 months after Vanessa's surgery. Julian was in the kitchen making coffee, and I was sitting on the living room couch, reading through some new medical journals. The neighborhood was completely still. Then the doorbell rang. I wasn't expecting any packages, and Margot wasn't supposed to come over until much later that evening. I put my journal down, walked through the hallway, and pulled open the heavy oak front door. My breath caught in my throat for just a fraction of a second. One day, my parents stood at the door of my house and I hadn't seen them since that horrific night in the hospital waiting room. They looked incredibly different. The wealthy, intimidating aura that used to follow them everywhere they went was completely gone. My father looked 10 years older. His shoulders were slumped, his hair was noticeably thinner and completely gray, and he was wearing a simple, inexpensive sweater instead of his usual tailored suits. My mother looked small and fragile, her face stripped of the heavy, perfect makeup she used to wear like a shield. They didn't look like the authoritative figures who used to strike fear into my heart. They no longer stood there as the commanding parents who expected absolute obedience. They just looked like two deeply broken, incredibly sad older people. They were standing at the bottom of the porch steps, keeping a very respectful, careful distance from my front door. It was a physical representation of the massive boundary they finally understood they could not cross without my explicit permission. "Elara," my father said. His voice was soft, rough, and trembling slightly. He didn't take a single step forward. "We are so sorry to show up unannounced. We know we have absolutely no right to be here. We didn't want to send another letter. We needed to look you in the eye." I stood in the doorway, my hand resting casually on the doorframe. I didn't feel the sudden, terrifying panic that used to grip my chest whenever they were near. I just felt a calm, steady observation. "You shouldn't have come here," I said quietly, my voice devoid of any anger. "I read your letters. I saw the bank transfers. I know what you are trying to do." My mother let out a small, choked sob and covered her mouth with her hand. She looked down at the concrete driveway, unable to meet my eyes. "We are doing the work, Elara," my father continued, swallowing hard. "We have been in therapy every single week. We are facing exactly what we did to you, and exactly what we allowed your sister to become. We are entirely estranged from Vanessa. We haven't spoken to her in months. We finally see the absolute truth of our family, and it is entirely our fault." He paused, his eyes filling with tears that he didn't bother to wipe away. "We are not here to ask you to come back to us," he said, his voice breaking. "We know we destroyed that bridge completely, and we know we don't deserve your forgiveness. We are just here to tell you that we see you. We see the incredible, brilliant woman you became without us. We see how thoroughly we failed you. And if you never speak to us again for the rest of your life, we will completely understand. But we are just people begging for a single chance to eventually, maybe, earn a tiny place in your life." They stood there, completely exposed, stripped of their pride and their money, offering me the one thing I had literally begged for my entire childhood: genuine, unconditional accountability. They were no longer my judges or my executioners. They were just people asking for a chance. I looked at my father's tears, and I looked at my mother's shaking shoulders. I thought about the terrified, isolated 28-year-old girl sitting in a cheap apartment with an urn of ashes, crying until her lungs burned. I thought about the grueling 100-hour weeks, the absolute exhaustion, and the immense, unbreakable strength it took to survive their betrayal. I took a deep breath, the cool morning air filling my lungs. I looked them straight in the eyes, ready to give them my final answer. "I appreciate that you're going to therapy," I finally said, breaking the heavy silence that had settled over my front porch. "I genuinely do. It takes a massive amount of uncomfortable, painful work to look in the mirror and admit that you destroyed your own family. I am glad you are finally facing the reality of what happened, and I am glad you are no longer letting Vanessa manipulate you." My father looked up, a tiny, fragile spark of hope lighting up his tired eyes. He took a half step forward, perhaps thinking this was the opening he had been praying for. I immediately held up my hand, stopping him dead in his tracks. "But recognizing your mistakes does not automatically entitle you to a reward," I continued, my voice firm and completely unwavering. "An apology, no matter how sincere it is now, does not act like a time machine. It does not undo the years I spent starving, exhausting myself to the bone, and crying alone in a freezing apartment while you told the rest of the world that I was a worthless junkie." My mother let out a quiet, trembling gasp, burying her face in her hands. "You are asking for a chance to know me now," I told them, looking at the people who were no longer the commanding authorities of my youth, but just two broken people begging for an opportunity. You are looking at the chief of trauma surgery. You are looking at a woman who built an incredible, fulfilling life from absolute nothing. But the truth is, the daughter you are actually looking for, the quiet, desperate girl who just wanted her parents to love her as much as they loved her sister, she is gone. She died 7 years ago when you decided to believe a vicious lie instead of your own flesh and blood. You held a funeral for me, remember? I am just honoring it. I watched the devastating reality of my words sink into their expressions. The fragile spark of hope in my father's eyes completely extinguished, replaced by a profound, hollow acceptance. They had come here knowing this was the most likely outcome, but hearing it spoken out loud, with such absolute, calm finality, was the final nail in the coffin of our relationship. "I forgive you," I said softly.
And it was true.
The burning, toxic anger that used to keep me awake at night had been entirely washed away. I forgive you because carrying around hatred for you is a burden I simply refuse to carry anymore. I want you to find peace. I want you to continue your therapy and figure out how to live with yourselves. But I am not going to be part of that process. My life is full. I have a new family who loves me unconditionally, and I have a career that demands my absolute best every single day. There is simply no room left for you. My father nodded slowly, the tears freely falling down his cheeks. He didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice or demand respect like he would have a decade ago. He just looked at me with immense, agonizing regret. "We understand, Elara," he whispered, his voice cracking violently. "We truly do. We needed you to know how sorry we are. We will not bother you again. We will respect your boundaries." He reached out and gently took my mother's arm. She was completely inconsolable, leaning heavily against him, as if her legs could no longer support her weight. Without another word, they slowly turned around and walked down the driveway. I stood on the porch and watched them get into their sensible, understated car. I watched them pull out of the neighborhood and disappear down the street. I didn't feel a sudden pang of regret. I didn't feel the urge to run after them and tell them I changed my mind. I just felt an overwhelming, profound sense of closure. The heavy, dark chapter of my life titled The Voss Family had finally reached its absolute, undeniable conclusion. I turned around, walked back inside my beautiful house, and firmly shut the heavy oak door behind me, locking it with a satisfying click. Julian was standing in the hallway holding 2 steaming mugs of black coffee. He had heard the entire exchange through the slightly open window. He didn't ask me if I was okay because he already knew the answer. He just handed me a mug, wrapped his free arm around my waist, and kissed the top of my head. "You handled that perfectly," he murmured against my hair. "It's finally over," I replied, leaning into his warm embrace, taking a long sip of the bitter coffee. "It is actually completely over." And it was. Over the next few years, I occasionally heard updates about the remnants of my biological family through Aunt Margot, who still came over for Sunday dinners and filled our home with loud, unapologetic life. The updates were exactly what you would expect. Vanessa's life had become a masterclass in isolated misery. After her physical recovery, the social execution was absolute. The entire extended family treated her like a total pariah. She lost all her wealthy friends, her massive social media following vanished the second her pristine image cracked, and she was forced to move out of our parents' luxurious home. Without their financial support, and with her reputation entirely in shreds, she had to face the real world with absolutely zero actual skills. She was living alone in a tiny apartment on the outskirts of Boston, completely alienated, stewing in the toxic reality that her obsessive need to destroy me had actually resulted in her own complete ruin. My parents stayed true to their word. They never showed up at my house again. They continued their grueling psychological therapy, desperately trying to salvage whatever was left of their own mental health. They spent their retirement quietly, trying to make amends to the universe in small, silent ways. They had effectively lost both of their daughters, one to a psychotic web of lies, and the other to the brutal, undeniable truth, but none of their tragedy touched me anymore. I was completely insulated from their darkness, My life moved forward with a momentum that was completely unstoppable. Julian and I eventually bought a small cabin up in Michigan, a quiet retreat where we could escape the relentless pressure of the city. We spent our weekends hiking, cooking massive meals with Aunt Margot, and building a foundation of absolute trust and transparency, the exact opposite of the house I grew up in. At the hospital, Dr. Evelyn Hart eventually stepped down from her clinical duties, and she personally endorsed me to take over her seat on the National Trauma Advisory Board. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was actively shaping the future of trauma medicine. My career was at an absolute, undeniable peak. I poured all of my energy, my brilliance, and my passion into the life I had actively chosen. I continued to break records and redefine protocols at Blackridge Trauma Center. I trained a whole new generation of surgical residents, passing down the exact same intense, uncompromising standards that Dr. Evelyn Hart had taught me. I saved hundreds of lives, pulling mothers, fathers, and children back from the exact same brink of death that I had pulled Vanessa from, sometimes, usually late at night when the emergency room is quiet and the rain is hammering against the hospital windows. I think back to that terrible phone call 7 years ago. I think about the moment my father told me I was dead to them. For a long time, I believed that was the worst thing that could ever possibly happen to a person. But standing where I am today, looking at the incredible respect of my peers, the unwavering love of my husband, and the lives I have physically saved with my own 2 hands, I realized something entirely different. Being erased by the Voss family wasn't a death sentence. It was an absolute liberation. They didn't destroy me. They just cleared the path for me to become exactly who I was always meant to be. I didn't just survive their lies. I completely conquered them. And as I strip off my bloody surgical gloves, wash my hands in the scrub sink, and look at my own tired but incredibly strong reflection in the mirror, I know one thing for absolute certain. Lena was right. I never let them decide who I was, that I decided for myself.